Welcome, everyone, to this week's episode of 15 Minutes and a Big Idea. We've got a lot to get to today, so I just want to encourage you, follow, do all those things y'all are so good to do that move this podcast forward. Be willing to share with a friend. Anything you can do to help will be great. So I want to dive in because I want to give a lot of attention to this text and what's going on in it and what we can learn from it rather than all the introduction stuff, because there's a lot going on here. All right, Philippians 2, verses 3 and 4. Philippians 2, verses 3 and 4. It says, "Do nothing from selfishness or empty conceit, but with humility consider one another as more important than yourselves. Do not merely look out for your own personal interests, but also for the interests of others." Today, we're looking at a continuation of what it means to walk worthy of the gospel. Paul wants to build communities that can stand together and strive together for the gospel in boldness against those who might persecute them. What is it going to take for that to happen? What sort of Christian community will be able to stand for the gospel and strive to move the gospel forward? Well, Paul's going to give them attitudes and actions that can do that very thing. Even in the midst of suffering and persecution, these things have worked throughout all of Christian history, from the very beginning of the New Testament church all the way into the present, and we should be mindful of them as well. If these are the attitudes which could move the message of Christ forward in those hostile circumstances, surely we would be wise to listen to them as well and adopt them for effectiveness in situations that aren't nearly so dire. Last week, Paul began an appeal for people to go deeper into relationships and fellowship in the gospel. Because they've tasted encouragement, consolation, unity, affection, and compassion, they should yearn for more and more of that by having unity of mind, heart, spirit, and purpose. This sort of unity is going to be essential for fellowship in the gospel, as we can do more together than we can do apart. And today, Paul is going to kind of expand that list, but he's going to look at opposite behaviors. Last time we looked at behaviors we need to adopt. Today, we're going to look at behaviors that we need to move out of our lives, as they do not live and conduct ourselves in a way that is worthy of the gospel. Today's big idea is esteem others above yourself. To understand how and what it means and the need to esteem others above yourself, we'll look at number 1, don't be selfish. Number 2, be humble. And number 3, look out for others' needs. Don't be selfish, be humble, and look out for others' needs. Selfish, humble, and look will be the words that guide our study today. Paul begins with the words, "Do nothing from selfishness or empty conceit." The word selfishness here is the exact same word that Paul uses back in chapter 1:17 to describe the attitude of some that preach Christ, the attitude they preach Christ out of. The word in the King James here that they use is strife. And if you put the words of selfishness and strife together, I think you really get the idea there. That there is a strife, or there is a relational discord that occurs, a friction that occurs because of a pride that it emerges out of. So it's strife that emerges out of a heart of pride, or fighting that emerges out of a heart of selfishness, we might say. The next word gives us a hint as to why. Why is it that pride emerges out of such a heart? Well, the NASB that we're using for Philippians, that was a choice we made, calls it empty conceit. And I think the word empty there really helps us see what Paul is getting at. Once again, the King James helps us here because it uses the word vainglory. And those two phrases, vainglory and empty conceit, they have within them the notion of the desire or the reaching for acclaim, recognition, or esteem that one does not deserve, that is not rightfully theirs. It might be presuming that one deserves praise that they really don't. This is a person who walks around thinking they're better than others. And they may especially, not just walking around think they're better than others, but claiming spiritual maturity and spiritual responsibilities that they don't actually have or have the right to. It's the person who thinks they're ready to be a teacher or an elder, but they're just loud. It's not that they're a leader. It's not that they're a godly shepherd. It's that they are loud. They have the assumption of maturity, but they're projecting that. They're giving an appearance and striving to receive the acclaim of Christian maturity, when in fact they're really lying to others, and sadly, they're likely lying to themselves. Now, some have connected this to Paul's discussion in chapter 3 on the need for continual growth and to not think we have attained it. It seems that because of the Philippian heritage that we talked about, of them being a Roman colony, and because of the success they had, there may have been an air of exceptionalism in that church and in that community that caused that church to feel that way, to feel as though they were perfect and they had it all together and they didn't need to grow or they didn't need to improve. And that's the vain glory that's there, because if I'm perfect and I don't need to grow and I don't need to improve, I should be unrestricted from any spiritual opportunity that is before me, any spiritual acclaim. And when that starts to happen, our only chance to maintain perfection whenever we get in a church situation like that is to project it. Whenever everyone begins to act like they've got it all together, the only way to remain in there, at least to our carnal minds, is to project perfection. And when we start projecting perfection, we start behaving in ways that are unbecoming to our maturity. To which Paul gives a sharp contrast. And he says, instead of selfishness or empty conceit, we should have a lowliness of mind and esteem others better than ourselves. The solution to squabbling and projecting false spiritual maturity is humility, specifically humbleness of mind, which Paul goes on to say means or equates to esteeming one another's better than yourself. We should choose and train our minds to think of other Christians as better than us. So there's a quote out there that circulates that I want to address here. And the quote is something along the lines of, true humility isn't thinking less of yourself, it's thinking of yourself less. Now, this is often attributed to C.S. Lewis. And it's not actually from C.S. Lewis. It's a Rick Warren summary of a C.S. Lewis quote. Now, obviously, we should have a personal value because we're in the image of God and Christ died for us. So there's a level of humility is not thinking lower of ourselves than we actually deserve. However, this teaching is clearly teaching that we should consider others as more important than ourselves. And for some of us, humility may mean deflating our inflated sense of ego. For some of us, in order to give room for people to be thought of as higher than us, we need to deflate. And so it's not just thinking of ourselves less, it is thinking less of ourselves and realizing we're not as important or as great as we think we are. We need to have a posture that honors other people over ourselves. Now, in Lewis's quote, his point, which gets summarized and then shared on social media, is that, and it's a lot longer than the quote that's given, it's not so pithy, is that if we give all our energy and attention to thinking about how humble we are, it can paradoxically become a source of pride. That's really his point, is that if someone's talking all the time about how humble they are and they're just woe is me all the time, they're really missing something. And that humility requires not just the pushing down of oneself, but the raising of others. And so if it's just the pushing down of ourselves, we're actually projecting false humility and we're projecting spirituality, and it might be vainglory. So we've got to do both things here. We've got to perhaps lower our view of ourselves, but we've also got to raise the view of others. Sometimes this requires mental effort and attention, but we can always find ways to see things that are admirable in every single other Christian. There may be things that are not so good about them, but there's always things that are commendable, and we need to train our minds to see those things. Turn our attention to their strengths and rejoice in God for his provision in their life, and stop viewing everything as a contest, because then that's when we're going to strive for that vainglory. And Paul takes this up a level. Considering one another with greater importance isn't just an intellectual exercise. As with all things in the New Testament, it is embodied. It requires a mental belief and thought process, but it also requires embodied obedience. The true test of humility is, do we show the same interest and effort to others' affairs as we do to our own? One simple way this is manifested is in our conversations with others. When we talk to each other, we should have a disposition and posture that wants to learn about others before we talk about ourselves. We've all met a person that as soon as we say hello, they start talking about themselves, whether it be their kids, work, the sports they like, or whatever interests them. They're not thinking at all about you. And as Christians, when we enter that sort of situation, we should just say, good for you. I'm glad I can honor you above myself. But we shouldn't be that sort of person, because that sort of person is a pain to talk to, and it's the sort of person that gets avoided. We should be a person who is genuinely interested in what others say and not just speak our own mind. Really, our personal conversations are just a barometer, though, of our care for others. The question really becomes, am I willing to serve others above my own interests? Am I willing to serve others above my own interests? Now, there is so much conversation about personal needs and boundaries and that sort of thing, and I do not want to dive off into that right now. We don't have time. We're already 10 or 11 minutes into a 15-minute episode, and I'm already behind. So what do I want to say about that? Well, I'd say first, if you want to send us a question on Q&R, like how do we esteem others better than ourselves and look to their interests above our own, without, creating bad boundaries or perpetuating potential ungodliness in them, I would love to have that conversation. I would. Where I want to hit you today, if you'll allow me, where I want to challenge you today is, are you willing to suspend your recreation and enjoyment for the needs of others? We're not talking about putting others' wants above your needs. I'm saying, can you put their needs above your wants? Before we talk about putting others' needs above our own, we need to talk about putting their needs over our wants. That means as I'm making plans, I prioritize serving other people. I don't necessarily prioritize my recreation. If someone has an urgent need and all I have to do is something that's recreation and relaxation, I should at least consider foregoing that for the good of them. Perhaps I should be willing to move my plans around so I can be of greater service to them. And that's the heart of service that we need, that longs to find satisfaction and gratification in serving others. Finds gratification in serving others because we see them as greater. It's a higher good to us than our own personal needs. So as we wrap this up, we see another crucial attribute of conducting ourselves worthy of the gospel, and that is a spirit that is anti-competition. Anti-competition. It refuses to go toe-to-toe for superiority. It refuses to give an appearance of spirituality. Instead, the way it shows spirituality and growth is it views others as more important and recognizes the good in them and serves them over my own desires. A heart that longs to serve others will not allow pride to grow. It's like a weed treatment for a garden. Or for a garden or for a yard, I suppose. You treat it and the weeds just don't have a way to start growing. When you make a habit of serving others, you're making it so that conceit and striving cannot grow. And these 4 verses are all attitudes that Christians must work towards because they're conditions that are necessary for us to work together for the gospel to move forward. When I use vain conceit, I don't think of myself... When I refuse this sort of vain conceit, in that case, I don't think of myself as the best. And so it doesn't have to be my way. And it can be I can strive for unity of mind and spirit and heart and purpose because it's no longer my way or the highway. These are the attitudes we need to have for healthy church communities that can be the seedbed of allowing the gospel to move forward. It sets that foundation, because if that foundation is not there, the striving will cause us to eat ourselves alive before very long. So let's ask, do you ever act in a manner that strives to display how righteous you are? Do you ever speak on certain topics with the purpose of making yourself look spiritually mature? Do you try to project that you're better than others? Do you think you're better than others? Do you have that thought sometimes? Are there people at church that you consider yourself smarter, more righteous, or more mature than? How could you serve them? How could you actively put yourself below them? Is there someone at your church who is great, and who is respected, and who is a leader, but is truly a person of service? Could you go with them and serve with them and learn from them? Not for the purpose of appearing spiritual by being around a spiritual person, but for the purpose of learning how do you prioritize the needs of others over the needs of yourself. Thank you so much for joining us today on 15 Minutes in a Big Idea. Today's big idea: esteem others above yourself.